dass man von uns verlangt hat, zu schwören, für Volk und Vaterland, wenn es notwendig ist, also auch das Leben zu opfern. Das fanden wir eigentlich selbstverständlich.
By the end of the war, the morale of the German army was crushed. Everyone seemed to know that the Reich was coming to an end. But there was a group of citizens who did not share this mentality. The Hitler Youth was made up of children and teenagers, in some cases far from the age of majority. But what they lacked in experience, they made up for in fanaticism. They had been indoctrinated from a young age to superimpose the ideas of the Nazi Party over even their own lives, and they had become the staunchest defenders of the Reich. This included committing terrible brutalities. So it was that the Allies were ordered to treat these young people like any other fighter and to have no room for mercy. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about how the Hitler Youth killed and died. By 1944, German troops were in full retreat. The territory of Eastern Europe conquered in the previous 3 years was quickly liberated by the Soviet Red Army. Meanwhile, in the West, the Allies were planning their landing in Normandy. The immense number of casualties suffered on the Eastern Front had exhausted the Nazi forces, both in equipment and men. As their enemies drew ever closer to Berlin, Hitler made the drastic decision to turn to another sector of the population, the boys and girls of the Third Reich. These members of the Hitler Youth had already been involved in the war, but their tasks, up to that point, had been in support. The work that the Nazi leaders had in mind for them now was much more dangerous. These miners would form combat divisions and be sent to the front to fight fiercely against the invaders. First, those close to adulthood, 18 or 17 years old, were used. But it was not long before children of 14 or even younger were forced to kill and die for their country. The first few times the Allies and Soviets encountered these youth brigades, some soldiers hesitated before pulling the trigger. But in many cases, the Germans did not. Several of these teenagers were complete fanatics, willing to take part in suicide missions to annihilate the enemy. This led, as we mentioned at the beginning, to the military leaders of the invaders giving strict orders to treat members of the Hitler Youth like any other Nazi fighter. They were victims of indoctrination, but nothing could be done for them. There was no room for any kind of mercy on the battlefield. Those who did not fall on the front could be tried and executed, regardless of their young age. This was the case, for example, with Heinz Petri and Josef Schoner, aged 16 and 17.
Under interrogation, Petri, the 16-year-old, admitted being a spy. They were then imprisoned in Aachen prison. There was a day-long hearing in front of a US military court, made up of members of the 9th Army, and the pair, despite their age, were sentenced to death by firing squad on the 29th of March 1945 in a court-martial in Mönchengladbach for committing acts of espionage which were damaging to the war effort. The jury of officers came up with a 2/3 majority, and the death sentences were carried out to show the German people how serious the Americans were to remove the poisonous breath of German militarism and Nazi ideology from the face of the earth completely.
Worse still, some of these divisions were part of the SS, the most important paramilitary organization in Nazi Germany. They were responsible for the worst brutalities on both the Eastern and Western fronts. And, whether by force or with pleasure, in many cases these young people also took part in these war crimes. There are known cases in which prisoners were summarily shot by members of the Hitler Youth, supposedly without the slightest sign of remorse. If a member of this group fell into Soviet hands, he knew that his life was over. Being a minor was no excuse. From the time they entered into action until the end of the war, thousands of boys and girls were killed in combat or executed. But how did this force begin to form, so in line with National Socialist doctrine, so much so that it could even surpass that of much older men? How did such a level of blind fanaticism come about? The Hitler Youth Organization was created in 1922, 2 years after the origin of the Nazi Party, under the name of the Youth League. Its purpose was to train and recruit future members of the SA, the Storm Section, the main paramilitary group before the SS took more power. Clearly, only the Aryan population was allowed to join. From the age of 10 and until they reached the age of majority, children affiliated with this group were indoctrinated in the policies and ideologies of the party. By 1930, under the name by which it would be known during the war, the organization had about 25,000 members, and the following year, it became officially part of the SA. In 1933, when Hitler came to power in Germany, the Hitler Youth had an incredible increase in its membership, having almost 2.5 million children in its ranks. But it was not only because of the people who signed up. In many cases, they absorbed other youth organizations, sometimes by force. They became the only association for minors in the country, while their numbers grew exponentially. Children who were not members were harassed by various sectors of society. They were mocked by students and teachers alike, and might not receive their graduation diploma, which also kept them from studying at university. Employers had the right to reject them as apprentices, and they were excluded from sports teams. All of these factors created immense pressure to join the organization. However, in 1939, just months before the start of World War II, conscription became mandatory. Parents who refused to enlist their sons and daughters were investigated by the authorities and often arrested. The Nazi leaders saw members of the Hitler Youth as representatives of the Aryan future of the Reich, and so the ideology of the party was taught to them as soon as they joined. Weekly meetings were held where the older members read Nazi texts to the younger members. Among them was Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, the book written by Adolf Hitler himself. It was not long before ideas of racial superiority over Jews and Slavs were engraved in the young minds. They were also taught the uselessness of Christianity and the church, and they even organized to speak at meetings of these groups. Above all, the idea that the Reich must survive, even if it meant their deaths, was repeated ad nauseum. As war approached, military training began to be added to the curriculum. Common weapons and their use were taught, as well as basic combat tactics and strategies. Physical ability began to take precedence over academics. These young men were gradually molded into fanatical soldiers, willing to die for the Führer and the 1,000-year Reich. Although not all members shared this fervor for the party, the harassment they suffered from the most indoctrinated kept them silent and remained part of the organization. World War II began on September 1, 1939, with the German invasion of Poland. Not long after this event, it was decided that the Hitler Youth should become fully involved in the country's war effort. By the following year, these teenagers were already part of the German postal and railway services. When the Allies began their bombing raids on German territory, they were assigned to relief tasks, such as in fire brigades. For now, the only direct combat they participated in was as crews of anti-aircraft divisions, protecting cities from enemy aircraft, as we can hear below.
Leistungen kann ich kaum beschreiben. Es kam ein Luftwaffenoffizier zu uns in den Unterricht und verkündete uns, dass die Jahrgänge 26 und 27 dieser bestimmten Klassen der höheren Schulen mit dem 10. oder 15. Februar 1943 zur Flak kämen als Luftwaffenhelfer. Wir sind alle aufgesprungen, haben gejubelt, es war ein ohrenbetäubender Lärm. Und nun auf einen Schlag wurden wir Soldaten, ehe wir es gehofft hatten. Nur Freude.
But this limited exposure to action was about to change dramatically. By 1942, the war had dragged on longer than Nazi leaders had expected. Setbacks in the North African campaign, plus the serious complication of the advance on the Eastern Front, meant the loss of large numbers of men for the Germans. So some high-ranking officers, such as SS Chief Heinrich Himmler, began to consider members of the youth as military reserves. In early 1943, Hitler approved the creation of a combat division made up entirely of members of the organization, aged 17 or 18. Their training soon began, where the ideas of cruelty and sacrifice learned in the previous years were put into practice. By 1944, their training was complete. Party leaders were impressed by the bravery and high morale displayed by its members and by the enthusiasm with which they expressed their ideology. It was decided that their baptism of fire would be in one of the most famous and bloodiest operations of the entire conflict, the Normandy landings. On June 6, 1944, the Allies invaded the French coast. It was here that the new division first encountered its enemy, made up mostly of British and Canadian soldiers. The bravery and courage of the children and teenagers astonished the invaders, throwing themselves fearlessly upon the tanks and destroying 28 of them. But the Allies' superior training and tactics soon proved too much for the young Nazis. Before the assault on the beaches was over, they had lost 3,000 soldiers. By the first month of fighting, the division had suffered 60% casualties, killed and wounded. Soon, their high morale had plummeted, and they were faced head-on with the reality of war, as one former member recounts below.
Ich hatte viele Freunde, mit denen wir hingegangen sind. Das waren wirklich Freunde, also nicht nur so Soldaten, sondern wir waren Freunde. Und von denen sind innerhalb von 14 Tagen oder 3 Wochen sind 3 Mann gefahren. Also das war da ziemlich hart und dann fühlt man sich als Kanonenfutter. Ne?
Even so, they continued to fight against the Western powers with ferocity. But this was not the only front Germany had to deal with. After their famous defeat at Stalingrad, the Germans had been beaten back, closely pursued by the Soviet Red Army. To make up for the numerous losses, the Hitler Youth began recruiting boys and girls of increasingly younger age. It was not unusual to see 14-year-old fighters, while those of 10 or 12 played support roles. The Russians, however, did not usually pay attention to this. From the beginning of their offensive, they were dominated by their thirst for revenge, wanting to repay the Nazis for the brutalities suffered on their territory. There were cases where, when a young member of these organizations fell into Soviet hands, the soldiers would give him just one blow and send him to his mother. But on many other occasions, his treatment was no different than that of any other prisoner of war. Large numbers of children were sent to forced labor camps and many died there. By 1945, war had come to Germany and the Nazis were desperate. For Hitler, the time had come for total war. There were no more civilians, only combatants. To confront their enemies, they were forced to draw on the last reserves of the population they had left. In addition to the German line army, a militia known as the Volkssturm, or People's Storm, was formed. It was made up of every male, aged 16 to 60, who had not yet been drafted into the country's armed forces. If anyone refused, he was arrested or executed by SS soldiers. Many members of the Hitler Youth were added to these divisions, which were placed under the command of the most fanatical officers in the Reich. They needed this kind of blind loyalty for the missions they were sent on. Typically, they were given anti-tank weapons and ordered to hide until the armored vehicles passed by. At that point, they would attack and destroy the vehicle. Some US soldiers reported encountering children as young as 8 years old, armed and waiting for their enemies. Listen to one of these child soldiers in the video below.
So sind wir also am 4. April 1945 gemustert worden. Ein Teil meiner Klasse wurde tauglich gemustert und wir kriegten dann auch die Tarnanzüge der Waffen-SS. Natürlich war das für mich so, man musste die Ärmel und die Beine hochkrempeln. Ich war 1,60 Meter, also so kleine Tarnanzüge waren offenbar selten.
Many other members were trained to serve as spies and saboteurs. This operation became known as Werwolf. It was not only children who took part in these actions, although they formed a large part of their ranks. They had been ordered to carry out guerrilla actions to sow chaos behind enemy lines. But the disorder that characterized German plans at this time of the war, coupled with poor training, resulted in the frequent failure of these attacks. There were numerous cases where, despite being minors, captured werewolves were shot by the Allies, accused of espionage, as in the aforementioned case of Petri. But as could be expected, these new forces made up of young and old had no effect on the enemy advance. The Soviets continued to rapidly approach the capital. During the Battle of Berlin, the militias formed an integral part of the city's defense. They were reported to have fought with much greater fervor than the veteran officers and soldiers of the German army, perhaps because the latter already saw that defeat was certain. On numerous occasions, even when completely surrounded, the young men fought to the death of the last member rather than surrender. There were even cases where they took their own lives before being taken prisoner. That was the extent of their indoctrination. In the last days of the war, to avoid unnecessary deaths, Helmuth Weidling, the general in charge of the defense of Berlin, ordered the youth combat divisions to disband. But in the chaos of this battle, the directive was never carried out, and these miners continued to die in droves until the German capitulation. The forces of the Third Reich signed their surrender on May 8, 1945. Immediately after this, with the country occupied by the Allies and the Soviets, the process of denazification began. This movement sought to eliminate all traces of the ideology and politics of the National Socialist Party from local culture. The Hitler Youth was affected by this movement, and the group was banned. Although there was evidence that some of its members had committed war crimes, due to their young age, they were not tried for them. Likewise, some adult leaders of the organization were sentenced to prison, and other members of the organization, as we saw in previous cases, suffered criminal sanctions for other types of crimes. Extermination camps. The aim was to confront them with the most terrible crimes committed by their party and to make them aware of the actions they helped carry out. On the other hand, compulsory education, which had been replaced by youth meetings, was put back into effect. It was not unusual to see 16 or 17-year-old boys with very poor reading or writing skills, as military actions had become more important than their academic training. There were cases where indoctrination had been too effective, and even after the war was over, boys and girls continued to clamor for National Socialism. But on many other occasions, these young people were able to realize that the party had stolen their childhood. Several former members became great whistleblowers, charged with raising awareness in the world about the crimes in which they had participated. We've reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, do you think it was justified to execute these young men for their actions in the war? Don't forget to leave your answer in the comments box and subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.